All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Dead Draw Gaming Podcast. As always, I am your host, Etchy, and joining me are three exceptional players from the team. First up, we have Twitter poster extraordinaire Jake Gearhart. Jake, how are you feeling about not going to Baltimore this weekend?
Yeah, I'm very glad to not be playing this format. I don't like it.
We'll get into your thoughts on it later. Next up, we have Benny Billinger, fresh off a amazing top 16 finish at Worlds in the seniors division. Benny, how excited for you are you for your first Masters regional?
Yes, I'm pretty excited. I've already played in like a few locals and stuff like that. But I've never played at like the Masters regional levels. I played in a few seniors day twos, but those are like 14 rounds, and you need like 30 match points to get top cut. So it'll be interesting to play that, especially with the new structure. It'll be very exciting.
All right, awesome. Lastly, we have Caleb Rogerson, also fresh off of a fantastic top 64 finish at Worlds in the Masters division. Caleb, how are you feeling after getting your top 64 finish?
Definitely feeling better than I felt after Worlds last year when I went 1-3. But and I was looking for a 32, but I do think that after Worlds, I'm feeling pretty good about Regidrago, and I'm feeling good heading into Baltimore with that.
Awesome to hear. So we have a lot to talk about today because, again, this weekend, Baltimore Regionals, first regionals of the season. Additionally, this weekend is the release of the new Stellar Crown set. So if we have time at the end, we'll talk about some Stellar Crown stuff, and we'll for sure cover it in the bonus Patreon episode. We covered a lot of Shrouded Fable format decks last podcast, and today we'll go over some of the same key ones, but also some of the more niche kind of surging decks going into this next tournament. But before we get into the meta, I wanted to talk first about tournament prep, everyone's favorite thing to do. It's been kind of a hot topic on Pokemon TCG Twitter over the last week or two, culminating in Liam Halloran flexing his 3,000 point ladder rank in PTCGL, which is ridiculous. I know a lot of our listeners are relatively new to the Pokemon TCG, and this might be their first season competing, maybe trying to get that invite. So I thought it would be useful to discuss this and kind of share our processes for how to prepare for a tournament. So I remember when I talked to Andrew Hedrick for our Worlds documentary, which will come out when it's ready. It's a really big project. It's going to take a while. But he mentioned he's a big believer in just grinding tons of games and mentioned that the young guys in the testing group really excel at that. So we have two of those young guys in said testing group here in Benny and Caleb. Is grinding games the key to performing well at tournaments?
So I obviously test a lot before events. I tested a lot before Worlds, especially on ladders like Pokemon Live. I was at like the bottom rank at like the beginning of August, and like now I hit like Arceus rank. So I obviously put a lot of time into Worlds, playing my Snorlax deck on ladder, and more recently I put a lot of time into Charizard for Baltimore. Um, so I do think that testing is definitely a very big part of doing well at tournaments, grinding as many games as possible, building up a spreadsheet, get a good idea of what your matchups are. But I also think it's at the end of the day, it's deck choice and how well you play your deck. And I mean, like that can obviously come from testing, but the list more specifically, you need to build it around cards that you like and that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, kind of building on what you mentioned because I want to clarify this for again some of those newer players, newer listeners. You mentioned kind of testing and playing games, and a lot of times people kind of group them together. Sometimes kind of people think of them as two separate things, where testing is more like kind of deliberate, setting up weird situations, and grinding games is just smashing the play button on PTCG Live. So when you say testing, are you kind of like grouping them all together into like your testing process, or how are you approaching it?
So like I have a deck right here that I normally like play hands with. So I mean, you could say that that's testing. But I think that testing is probably where more of the real games come from. I think when you're testing, you want to get the most valuable, like variants. You just want to have the best games that go into their testing. Yeah, so you need to have the most valuable testing to be able to ensure your deck success, as opposed to playing games on ladder where you're just playing as random people. They could be playing random decks. Whereas testing, you do know what deck you're playing against, and you know your strategy into it. So hopefully you can apply the strategy in a real tournament.
Gotcha. And then Caleb also mentioned as one of the grinders. How valuable do you feel like grinding games is to your success at a tournament?
Yeah, so I think that how I test kind of depends at what stage I am in preparation for a tournament. So a lot of times, like especially for a bigger tournament like Worlds or an IC, I try to figure out like what deck I think is the play for the tournament. And in doing that, I want to like test specifically certain matchups to see, oh, can my deck beat this? Will I have to play certain different cards to beat this one matchup? But then once I kind of find my deck and I'm mostly fine tuned on that, like at this point where I am at for Baltimore, I'm just with playing Regidrago and just grinding a bunch of games on the ladder because I just want to play a mix of different matchups and have like all experience with all different kinds of lines, not just against like the best of the best players, not just against certain matchups. Like although like it is important to test specific matchups, I've kind of already done that in preparation for Worlds, so really it depends. Like I think if you're kind of newer or if you're just at a point where you feel like you are looking to succeed still, I would suggest just picking one deck and sticking with it and then just playing a bunch of hands and kind of determining, oh, how can I play this hand differently in a different game and could that have been better? And that's kind of most of my testing.
I think I have like my experience though over the past couple of years is kind of a testament that how much like grinding games actually does help, because this past year, ever since like live came out, I just haven't been like but before when PTCGO was around, like I'd put in like at least like 100 games before a tournament, minimum on like on the ladder, and then probably play a couple online tournaments as well. But ever since live came out, I just haven't been doing that, and I definitely saw a big drop in my performance. I didn't have as much time to play like online and stuff, so yeah, I wasn't able to. But I also don't like. I'm not a huge fan of live, and playing online tournaments. There is like not as fun as it was on PTCGO. So I think that the people who are able to stick it out and play those hundreds of games definitely do see like a big boost. And if I wanted to like get back to how I was sort of last season, then I think I definitely need to put more time into grinding the ladder for sure.
Yeah, kind of on that note, I think it'd be useful to kind of talk about how you personally test then, Jake, if you aren't playing hundreds of games. I know we've talked a lot before about testing and stuff, and you're kind of just like, yeah, I just kind of play a bunch of games in my head and like think through everything that happens. So, how do you prepare for a tournament? How do you prepare for like Worlds, for example?
So it depends on the format, obviously. So I sort of group like practicing is like just playing games. Like you play the full game, whatever happens. And I think practicing is like something that's like super valuable, which is just playing on the ladder. But if you're trying to play in a new format, that's where like testing matters. And so that's just trying to come up with like first of all come up with all the ideas for decks, and like see if their general strategies can work. What you can usually do just like with pen and paper or like thinking about a deck, um, like in the Regidrago mirror, for example. There's like different lines you can take to like increase your chance of winning. Like you have to be aware of the possibility of doing double Curum, or also like getting a turn one attack off with like a Regidrago and then trying to use that damage to do a double knockout with Dragapult. Like those things you can plan out before you actually play any games. You don't need to play any games to figure out that those are possibilities. So that's sort of like the first step of learning a new deck or trying to build a new deck. And then there's testing, which is just to confirm that those things actually happen in practice. So like I think you sort of approach it like scientifically, like you have all these possible lines of play, and then you test to make sure that they actually happen like you expect them to happen. And then you figure out where, like in testing, you'll usually figure out things that you didn't think about before, and also like by realizing that things don't work out how you thought they would before, it like makes it easier to do it in the future to get to the correct answer from the start. So yeah, like this past season, I didn't have very much time to practice games. So I just like I still usually the thinking about decks and stuff, like thinking about lines, you can sort of do whenever. Like if you're just walking to class or something, you can think about those types of things. But playing, like testing and actually practicing is like the last step, which you definitely need to perform well at tournaments.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I can kind of share my experience with how I improved at preparing for a tournament this season, because I kind of didn't understand what good prep was like for a lot of the early season. I kind of just kept playing Rapid Strike because I like played it and almost made day two for like two tournaments. I was like, oh, I know how to play the deck. I'll just bring it to the next one. I'll do a few games before the tournament and be fine because the format didn't like change much during those tournaments. And that was a huge mistake because I basically just kept getting around 5 wins and never kind of getting over that hump. And it wasn't until EUIC where I kind of took a different approach. Again, kind of a different example because you can't grind games on live for something like EUIC because it was rotation. So obviously I can't play rotation games a month before rotation actually happens. But basically what I found to be most helpful was playing games against myself just on tabletop, just printing out proxies, thinking through all the lines. I did some coaching here and there. But I found that basically just like playing dozens of games against myself against like all the other common meta decks with just one deck, focusing on one deck for like a month straight, was what kind of really changed how really like opened my mind to what it looks like when you're actually prepared for a tournament. Because when I went to EUIC, like all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm just not surprised by anything that happens. I know all these situations, I know all the lines already. I don't really have to think too hard. I just got to make sure I don't mess up. For a lot of like the weird things that would happen during games, I was just kind of prepared for everything. So that is kind of what I would recommend for. It's not just grinding games, but also testing in the sense, kind of like what Jake was talking about, playing against yourself. Playing a lot of games in general is good, but you should try to like put some thought into it when you do that before you really just grind games mindlessly. You should kind of have a good idea of how to approach the matchups, good idea of your strategies, key cards, all that kind of stuff. So. Any other kind of thoughts or notes or advice to people for preparing for tournaments besides playing a lot of games?
I know personally lately I've been keeping data of my games on live, and it's been like decently helpful. I like track like when I go first, and like sometimes like when I'll make an adjustment to my deck, like, oh, did that change actually impact this game? And then I'll kind of total like how much it helped me, how much it hurt me by cutting a different card. And I'm kind of inspired by something Andrew Hedrick did with his Dialga deck leading up to, I think, Indie Regionals. So I've kind of been doing that recently with Regidrago, and I think it's helped me a little bit to just track my ladder games like that.
Yeah. In my spare time, like let's just say like I'm like queuing up for like a game or something. I normally like to open hand with the deck that I'm like testing right now. Like I normally build it IRL, for like if I'm webcam testing with one of my testing partners. I do really like opening your hand and like playing out like the first few turns because it shows a how consistent your deck is, and which I think is one of the most important things. And B, to make sure that you execute that turn one perfectly. So I really think that's very valuable, at least for me.
Yeah, I can second that. I do the exact same thing. I just have the deck next to me while I play games, and while I'm playing a game, I'll also just be solitaring against myself completely, just independently for no reason. And it definitely helps a lot too. Just it's so nice to like be in a position in a tournament where you get your turn on opening hand. You don't have to think. You just know exactly how you should do your first
Yeah.
couple actions, right? So the less thinking you have to do during a tournament, the better you will do in general. So definitely recommend that. And I think then we can just start talking about the different decks for Baltimore. So, again, we covered a lot of the main key decks last time. We'll cover some of those key ones again, but I kind of wanted to talk about some of the more niche ones or ones we didn't get opinions on last time. And I think we should probably start with kind of recently surging the Dusknoir decks. And what by that I don't mean like Charizard or Dragapult with the Dusknoir. I mean the decks that are really built around Dusknoir. So that would be like Banette Dusknoir that Henry Brand played to Worlds. And recently the Palkia Dusknoir has been getting a lot of attention online. When I was playing ladder a couple days ago, I literally hit it like 6 times out of 10 games. It was pretty hyped up a couple days ago, I guess. But I know Jake was playing a lot of the Banette Dusknoir stuff before. We did a tabletop video on it recently as well. I think it's the last video on the channel. You can check that out. But what are your thoughts on these types of decks in this format right now?
I think the Banette deck, like it's got a very unique matchup spread for the format. Like it's pretty good into Regidrago. Like if you just flip one of the heads, or like on the opening coin flip or your first shuppet flip, like you're pretty good for the rest of the game there, as long as the Drago player didn't get a crazy start with a bunch of energy switches. But the like some of its other matchups are a bit sketchy. With like the Ancient Box is not the best. Like you'll need a couple good like flips or Ionos to go your way to beat that. But I think the deck overall, it's a very high rolly deck, but it also takes like a lot of skill to play correctly, because you just have like so much control over how long the game takes, like how many turns, how many attacks. So yeah, a very interesting, very unique deck to play. I'm not like too big of a fan of the Palkia version. I think Palkia in general is like a solid card. Like I was testing it leading into Worlds because it's in general like pretty fine against Drago just as a card, because like it doesn't evolve from random basics that have low HP that can get Curumed or Phantom Dived, and then you can just knock out a bunch of Ogre Pawns, and that'll usually get you pretty far, or like the Pheasantipity Mew EX. And you can just try and trade evenly with Regidrago and beat them that way. So, and then the advantage of Palkia over the Banette is kind of like that matchup's a little bit worse, but stuff like the Ancient Box is a bit better because you're not weak to Dark. Obviously, you have something that can survive for a couple of turns. But Palkia is definitely a lot weaker against stuff like Charizard and Dragapult, the stage 2 decks, because those ones, like, they really suffer under item lock. And Palkia isn't winning the game fast enough just by popping a few Dusknoirs. Like you can obviously do that sometimes, but if the Charizard or Dragapult player sets up, it's like pretty hard to put on enough damage to out trade them. Okay, yeah, Palkia is a bit weaker against something like Raging Bolt, because you evolve from a V, so they can take 2 prize cards on that, and then also they have the ability to play around your one-hit KOs a little bit by managing their bench carefully or using Bravery Charms. So that matchup's like a bit worse. So overall, I think the Banette deck is just better. And like in this format, it's better to have a polarizing matchup spread, because you're not really going to get like if you. I think this is really a format where you just need to make a meta call and like hope it works out. So Palkia doesn't have like enough like great matchups to be worth it, in my opinion, whereas Banette does, and then Banette has some bad matchups too.
Yeah, I've been playing the Palkia deck a bunch the last few days because it's just fun to play. But I think the main reason it's been certainly just because its Ancient Box matchup is better than the Banette one, because you can just, it's so easy to Iona them to 3 and like nearly board wipe them on like turn 2, and then they just lose. So it's pretty strong for that. But yeah, if you have to, it does feel super high rolly. Dragapult does just incinerate you. Zard, sometimes you have a chance against, but Dragapult is just abysmal, completely awful. It is really fun though when you do get to just double Dusknoir and then Greninja to wipe out 220 HP Pokemon. But it's also just, yeah, I'm not like too scared of Palkia for Baltimore, because I think it's kind of like new enough that a lot of people aren't going to be comfortable playing it, and it is really hard to play. But I guess if you've been playing a lot of Banette, you would probably be comfortable switching to it. But I do think, yeah, Banette's probably just better in general for what I would expect the meta to be at Baltimore. But do y'all have any other thoughts on these Dusknoir decks? Benny, Caleb, have you played them at all?
I've played against some Palkia on the ladder. I think it seems strong, but also like mainly because I didn't know what my opponent was going to be capable of,
Sure.
and I like left him with 3 Duskulls on his bench, and they just went Candy Dusknoir, Dusklops all in one turn,
Yeah.
and like took 6 prize cards in one turn with Ursaluna, and I like could have knocked out one of the Duskulls, and I just assumed that he couldn't do that, but I was wrong.
Yeah.
And then after that game, I was like, this Palkia deck seems broken. But I do think Jake brings up a good point that Banette seems better against Drago and the Stage 2 decks. So other than like Ancient Box, I agree. Like I think that Banette probably has to be better because even if your Ancient Box matchup is like significantly worse, I still think having those matchups against like Charizard and Regidrago are going to be like the most popular decks. And even if Ancient Box is like top 3, third or something, it's still better to choose to have those polarizing matchups and be more favorable against the top couple decks there.
I've tested like a lot of Charizard leaning towards Baltimore, and one of the versions did have a 101 Dusknoir line. Um, I definitely like the fact that especially in Charizard that you can give your opponent a prize card. Because against like Drago and like any Ogre Pond decks, you're not really going to be able to hit like 210, which is knocking out an Ogre Pond, or like able to take the first 2 prizes unless you knock out a Squawk, which they shouldn't be benching in the first place. So I definitely like that aspect of it. But like if you have to hit Candy Pidgeot, Candy Charizard, and Candy Dusknoir um, before they like get an attack off, like you're just sacking. Um, like the deck is not that good to where you can do that all on the second turn. So I don't know how good Dusknoir is. I think I'd probably rather just play consistency cards, maybe like an Entei. But yeah, I don't really like Dusknoir a whole lot in Charizard. It also doesn't make your deck as consistent. So
Also, let's not play an NTV. Like,
well, okay, so I was playing NTV for a little bit because you can like one shot Ogrepon against Bolt and Drago, which allows you to take the first 2 prize cards. But I don't know, it's not
okay,
very good.
Entei's broken.
I was testing it before Worlds, like the last Charizard list I ended up on had Entei, but I felt like the Drago matchup still wasn't good enough. Like you just lose the game if you lose the opening coin flip, and then like you have to play like the going first version with like the 4 nest balls and everything. And that like if you win the coin flip and go first, like you're pretty good against Drago, but if you lose the coin flip, like you're just you're not winning like any of the games if they set up. So then like overall the matchup was like slightly unfavored, and I felt like that was just too much commitment for that tournament. It might be a little bit better now that stuff like Gardevoir is dying down and Ancient Box is picking up in popularity. Like Charizard's just inherently better against like the meta, so like maybe that matchup is like it's worth putting in that many cards to try and deal with Regidrago.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think the next deck then to cover is the deck that's been surging, and it's been picking up quite a bit of popularity online, and I wasn't really expecting to see this deck like at all again until next format. But Dragapult has been doing really well online lately. I think Benny said he's done some testing of the deck. What is going on with Dragapult? What is the argument to play Dragapult right now?
Yeah, so I played some games with Dragapult pretty recently. I think the deck is like surprisingly consistent if you build it properly. Because I know that was one of the problems that I faced the last time I was testing Dragapult, which was before NAIC. The deck didn't really feel very consistent, but now I think you get a lot more consistent, and I do think that you have a fairly good matchup against both Ancient Box and like the turbo decks like Miraidon and Roaring Moon. I think Raging Bolt can be 50-50, maybe slightly unfavored. Um, which is like I don't really care about Raging Bolt that much. I think you take a very favorable Charizard matchup. But the one concern about it was the Drago matchup. I did find the matchup to be pretty close, but it definitely did feel slightly unfavored, um, depending on how you set up and how they set up, because a lot of the times they just go knock out my Pidgey and I'm forced to like sack a ton off of Pheasantipity the whole game. So that's like the one problem with it. Um, but other than that, it's like very similar to Drago. Obviously, you don't have as broken of a V Star attack, um, but I think the deck's fine. Um, but I don't know if it deserves the hype that it's getting.
What's the art like? What does it do better than Regidrago that's like worth playing it over Drago?
Well, if you play a Dusknoir in it, you definitely have like some other lines that you have. Like I think it's way easier to take like 6 prizes in one turn with that deck as opposed to Drago. And then also 320 is like a much harder number to hit in this format than 280. Like you wouldn't think that 40 HP would make that much of a difference, but it does. So I guess like that's the argument to play Pult over Drago.
Also, like evolving from a 1 prizer is pretty good against like
Sure.
Raging Bolt and stuff
Yeah.
compared to Drago.
Yeah, you're just inherently better against like the turbo big basic 2/2/2 decks, right? So
Yeah.
Caleb, you played a lot of Drago. It is. Do you find that argument compelling enough to consider playing Pult?
Yeah, so I have been talking to a lot of people who are into Pult recently, and I think that the deck seems like very interesting. And I think that the big thing that people say like that they want to play it over Drago is that it has like a better ancient box matchup, a better like matchup against some of the 2 prize aggression decks like Rhydon, Raging Bolt. But I think that in my experience with Drago, like all these matchups are either fine to favorable, and I just have more experience playing Drago. But I think for someone like just picking up Drago or just like picking up Dragapult who doesn't have experience with either, I think Dragapult is like a solid option because with Drago you have to learn like a lot of different lines for these matchups, and I guess it would be the same with Dragapult, but I don't know like which deck is inherently stronger. Like once you get set up, I do think Drago gives you more like options, I guess. Like even if you fall behind a little bit with Drago, you still have kind of an Iono play with Drago. Whereas with Dragapult, if you lose like your basics early in the game, it's harder to come back because all they need to do is knock out like one Dragapult at the end of the game.
In terms of like build of Dragapult, what are people doing? Is it just like Pidgeot stuff, or is it more Xatu stuff?
No, I think
It's
it should definitely be Pidgeot. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it makes sense with the Dusknoir stuff. It's kind of easier to get that stuff off, right?
I think you should max Nest Ball.
Yeah, I agree. I think another argument to play Dragapult over Drago is maybe if you're not as comfortable in the Drago mirror match, or like you don't really want to take like a coin flip matchup to the most popular deck, you can play Pult and maybe design your deck to beat Regidrago like as much as you can. Like maybe put in like a Choice Belt or Ravska. Like I'm just like spinning ideas at this point, but I guess like that's one argument to play Dragapult over Drago is the mirror.
With Dusknoir, I think that Dragapult has like an easy route to kind of win against Drago in 2 attacks if you can get set up. Like even if you don't get to Dusknoir, you can play like a Thornton or something to get back Dusknoir and try to win in 2 attacks against Drago. And I think especially against Drago players who don't exactly see what you're planning to win in 2 attacks, they might stumble or like bench something that they can't bench, or like not target down your Duskull when they need to target it down, and then you can kind of get like a skill gap advantage against some of the Drago players. Where like with Drago, you might not be able to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Really interesting to kind of see this deck get hyped up almost out of nowhere, and it's the argument for it is pretty sound. I think it definitely makes a lot of sense to consider playing it for Baltimore. I think the next deck I want to talk about then is actually the deck that Benny played to a top 16 finish at Worlds. You played BlockLax, which is a deck that, once again, kind of like has like dipped down really hard and might be picking back up, is potentially a decent play going into Baltimore. So can you kind of talk about like why you played it for Worlds and like that meta compared to like now, where is it still worth playing it?
So so I played BlockLax to Worlds. I was very comfortable with it at that point. You know, I felt like its matchup spread against Drago, Charizard, and Guardy, which were the 3 most popular decks, at least to what I was expecting. I feel like the matchup spread was really good there. I didn't really expect to see Roaring Moon or Ancient Box, which ended up being my 2 losses in the tournament. The Roaring Moon was playing Spiritomb. It was Gabriel Fernandez. And then the Roy Moon I played against, like if they run Pekka, the match is like practically unwinnable. So those were the two losses, and I think after the Roy Moon placement at Worlds, the deck really like died down because there's like really no win con versus that, unless you were to run like a 1/1 Noivern with Mist Energies. So it died down there, but I haven't seen a lot of Moon recently. I think that deck has died down, which has made BlockLax possibly go up. And Lugia is not really a deck anymore, so you don't really have to worry about that as much. Um, but I guess one of the main problems now is the Ancient Box matchup, because like you're forced to flute pretty early, and you have to get um, at least two targets if they play Penny. Um, so that matchup is like pretty scary. They can, if you also don't like flute early enough, they can set up a board of like 2 Roaring Moons and 4 Flutter Mains, and like you just insta lose to that because they can just like keep on recycling attacks and stuff. And with Morlist nowadays playing Great Tusk, I feel like that there's also another line the Ancient Box can do to win that way. So that matchup's like kind of scary. But other than that, I do think you still have a favorable matchup spread versus Charizard and Drago. You don't really see a lot of Guardy anymore. I think that Miraidon can be a little bit sketchy because they can just send up a Zapdos and like kill your Mimikyu. But you do have Cornerstone, which like forces them to attack with Iron Hands, and then you can just like send up Mimikyu and force them to hard retreat off of Iron Hands, which is pretty good. So I guess that matchup's fine. Raging Bolt's like fine. You just like spam Mimikyus. If they have Sandy Shocks, you just try and get stuff off of Flute. One of the cool additions that I played in my Worlds deck was Mantine, and I really liked it there because it helped against both Lugia and Raging Bolt specifically, and Guardy. Um, but like against Raging Bolt, like they're normally gonna discard like their Squawk or their Ninja, so I don't have a chance to Erica's or Flute it. So you can just go Mantine, and then if you have enough Gust, you can just Gust them before and run them out of their switch outs. So I really like that card. I think that card should potentially be included in most lists if you're running a basic energy. So yeah, so I think Snorlax is pretty solid at this point, but just make sure that you're aware of the Ancient Box matchup mainly.
Yeah, I think after Worlds there was a kind of a surge in decks just having the Petra, the amount of decks that just had the Petra running around, and that's kind of been quite a bit less of an issue recently. Jake, you know a lot about control stuff, BlockLax in general. How do you feel about the deck right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Benny hit sort of all the points that like Guardy's going down, but Ancient Box is going up. So like those matchups, I felt like were like sort of similar. That they can both build like an unbeatable board state, but like it takes them a little bit to do that. So you have like counterplay, and then yeah, good against Regidrago is always a good thing to have. And if like more people are playing Charizard and then that's even more reason to play it. So yeah, BlockLax I think is pretty solid. I could definitely see it like doing very well for sure if it hits the right matchups. Lugia going down is like the biggest thing for it because that was like the reason I like personally wrote it off for Worlds like pretty early on is I just thought Lugia would be way too played for it. But we did see like Lugia was only like 11%. And it didn't even do very well at the tournament, so it'll probably go down even more for this tournament. Like I wouldn't be surprised to see Lugia at like 9 or 10%, but at the same time it could go up more because there's like less like top players. There's more like new players playing, and Lugia is like one of those decks that newer players gravitate towards because it's like pretty straightforward how you play all your matchups. But yeah, if you can dodge those early rounds players, then you'll be fine for the rest of the tournament.
Yeah, I guess that gives us a good segue to talk about Lugia then, really quickly. We did talk about it briefly last time, I believe, but I wanted to bring it up again because the way the meta has kind of shifted, it's kind of come back into honestly being like a decent safe play for Baltimore because a lot of those, again, like Dragapult Zard stuff, you should be totally fine into them with the Cinchino stuff. You can handle you can handle Ancient Box as long as you're playing Cinchinos totally fine. You just have like a nice even spread against where everything kind of is in the meta right now. The downside is you have to play Lugia to get that spread. So you have to just high roll and hit decently, get your double Archeops in the discard. I've been playing Lugia a lot. I've inadvertently become the Lugia guy, which is not the best title. um, but my main thoughts on the deck are it's a good play for Baltimore. I really don't want to play it, and I'd rather play anything else going into the tournament. But I will if I have to. I'm like I might drop from Baltimore, by the way. I'm gonna decide like tonight, but I'm like if I do go to Baltimore, I'm like 50% to play it. I think the deck is right now. I would heavily lean towards more Cinchino heavy list. I'm not a fan of like 3/3 Cinchino in general because I think it just clogs up your deck so much. But I keep going back to like that Japan prep tournament list, which is the 2/2 Cinchino with the Weird Ear. I feel like that just covers you pretty well for most things in the format in general. Gives you room for consistency and text and whatnot. Big fan of Pheasantipity still because you really want to make sure you win the games where you actually get double Archeops in the discard. Squawkabilly's cool, but I'm like still iffy on Squawkabilly. I don't. The problem with Squawkabilly is like Squawkabilly and Fez eats up so much board space when you do get to the point where you have like both of them on board. And I don't really want to pick between one or the other either. But you could just pray that Carmine does enough of the Squawk stuff for you in general. And also Squawk's kind of like harder to get out because generally I like Great Balls more than Nest Balls in Cinchino heavy lists because it's just easier to get out your Cinchinos. But if you're not playing the Nest Balls, then it's less likely to actually get out your Squawkabilly turn 1 too. So, but that's kind of my thoughts on how I would play Lugia. What do you guys think about Lugia right now? Does the meta seem? I mean, the meta does seem fine for it, but I don't know. Like, I don't want to play it. Talk me out of it.
Well, I can pretty comfortably talk you out of it. It was like probably the most hyped depth deck going into NAIC, and it gained a lot of hype right before Worlds, and it did horrible at both those events.
Look, I got
So
day
I
2 with
feel
it.
like
I did horrible in day 2, but I did make day 2 with Lugia at NAIC.
But like I don't think there was any in top 8 of like both events. I think
Yeah.
Rahul got 9th
Rahul got
with
9th,
it. But Rahul also ran like a very he ran a very interesting list, let's just say. I don't necessarily think it was very good, but like I just think Lugia is just that deck where if you high roll with it, it's great. But I don't know how often you're really gonna high roll with it, especially after Iron Thorns just won the World Championships.
So like after Worlds, I would not have considered playing Lugia for Baltimore at all. But kind of Ancient Box surging has helped run Quathorns kind of almost out of the format. It's much lower than it would have been right after, which is the main reason to play it is Ancient Box kind of helping correct the meta for Lugia inadvertently. Because yeah, like I wouldn't be afraid of Quathorns for Baltimore personally. So I wouldn't. I also wouldn't bother playing Fluttermane even if I was afraid of Quathorns because you're probably still not winning anyway, even with the Fluttermane. But
yeah, Quathorns yeah, you're right. I don't think Quathorns like really has a place in this meta anymore. But I mean, it still did win Worlds, so I think that there will still be people gravitating towards it because I want to play the World Championship winning.
There will be a percentage of Quathorns, yes. But other than that, I think the deck, I do expect it to be less played, but I think a lot of people are just going to end up talking themselves into the deck too. So I would expect probably around like 8 to 9% is what I would think for the deck.
I tested a lot of Lugia, I guess, heading up to Worlds with kind of a few players, and I found myself not liking the deck, but I do think it's in a better spot now for sure than it was for Worlds because the Ancient Box matchup is solid, Charizard's solid, Dragapult's solid, Thorns probably won't see very much play. Even like Miraidon's falling off, more so just a Raging Bolt, which is much easier to deal with than Miraidon for Lugia. I do think that like the one concern in the top few decks is that a lot of Regidragos are playing the Sinnoh, and I think the matchup is unfavored if they have Sinnoh, because I think if they get the first attack, regardless of if they have Sinnoh, they're in a good spot to win, and if they have Sinnoh, they can still win even if they don't get the first attack. But I think the main thing that if I was playing Lugia to this tournament, I would play the 3/3 Cinccino because I think it helps a lot against Charizard. Like I played a lot with 2/2 Cinccino and Wordier, and I think 3/3 is like a lot better against Charizard because you always want to have two Cinchinos. You don't always have like the luxury to go into Wordier for like a whole lot of energy to knock out a Charizard. Whereas Cinccino, you can do that for just 5 energies, which is still a lot, but usually it's not too bad.
I think talking about the deck that we keep mentioning but haven't talked about yet is Ancient Box, because we did talk about it a lot last time, but I wanted to get y'all's perspective on this deck that, again, got super hype after Worlds. Didn't do like amazingly at Worlds outside of, I think, it got, well, it won like juniors, right? Or got second, I think.
It won juniors, and then Gabriel Fernandez got top 4 with it in
Seniors. Right. But in Masters, I think the highest placement was like 40th or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, obviously after Worlds, it turns out that Ancient Box is really good into all the decks that did well at Worlds and has been very popular as a result. So I know, Benny, you were testing the deck. What are your thoughts on Ancient Boxes? It's obviously it was really good and well positioned in the meta a month ago. People are reacting to it and trying to counter it more aggressively now. Do you think it's still in a good spot for Baltimore?
So I was testing Ancient Box mainly when the hype began. This was like right after Worlds. We thought it could be a potentially good play into this meta if it has a favorable Drago matchup, which I think it actually does. But I ended up playing it to a best of 3 League Cup, which was actually like really good testing there, mainly because it was best of 3. So what I found there is that the deck is pretty fast and aggro, and it does have a pretty good matchup spread on paper. But I found that there definitely has some consistency issues, especially going first. There was towards the end, like my finishing record was 2-2-1. But I had like 2 win-ins to top 8, and in game 3 of my 4th round, I started with Flutter main draw pass. So I lost that one. And then in round 5, both game 1 and 3, my hand was like Flutter main and like draw attach pass going first. So I don't think the deck is very strong going first, at least. And I think that it's a little bit too slow, per se, like on the first few turns to beat like Charizard and stuff like that. But like obviously you have the triple gust strat against Drago, which like works a lot of the time. I think that match was like favored. But if you're expecting to see a lot of Zard, Dragapult, and like even Lugia, I don't think that matchup's like very good. Then I don't know if the deck is very good in that case.
Yeah, just to add on to the Ancient Box discussion, I think that the deck really falls off now that Charizard is kind of moving up in the ladder. I think Charizard might end up being the most popular deck at Baltimore Regionals, just like surpassing Drago slightly. And I think if that matchup is the most popular deck in the room, you really struggle there. Even though it's not like an abysmal matchup, I'd say it's somewhere in the range of like 40 to 45% win rate for you. I still think like your other matchups, you still can easily lose if you have a slower start against some of your good matchups because the deck has some inherent consistency problems, as Benny mentioned. I just think that your matchup spread kind of falls off once a lot of the turbo decks move away from playing turbo and now they're playing like Charizard or Dragapult, which are worse matchups for Ancient Box.
Yeah, speaking of Charizard, that's probably the best deck to talk about next, because has it's been weird because obviously does have the bad Drago matchup, but does destroy Ancient Box, has that favored matchup, and can kind of handle just everything else in the format pretty reasonably well. Again, Guardy going down, kind of what Jake was talking about earlier. If Regidrago does in fact go down in popularity, Jake, do you think Charizard is like the best play in general then?
I think in that case it would be, but I would be like shocked if Regidrago is not like it. Even if Charizard is number one, Regidrago is only going to be like 1% lower. Like I think Drago is probably going to be the most played deck, but yeah. So I think the matchup's just too rough. Like it takes too much in Charizard to get the matchup close. But like if everybody is just playing Ancient Box and two prize beat stick decks, then Charizard definitely is the play.
I'm gonna add on to the Charizard discussion. I have noticed that some people were playing the list that Tord played with the Rabska, and they said that the Dragon matchup felt pretty fine. So I don't know. I don't think that deck is like completely horrible. I do think that there is definitely some changes I would make to it, because like it has like Thornton and DTE, so it's not as much of a Charizard deck as you would think. It's more of a use Charizard early and then set up Radzard late game, so that you force your opponent to take multiple one prize knockouts, like after Iono. So I don't think that deck's horrible, but there was a few consistency issues that I noticed with the deck. I think it only ran like one nest ball, and I think for like a Charizard deck nowadays, I think you should at least be running 2 to 3. So if you ever to play that deck, I would probably make it more consistent.
Yeah, that is definitely like a Tord diff for that list in particular, for sure. Everyone else who like I talk to is like plays that version is like struggles with it, and yeah, Tord just. I feel like if you're not Tord, you should probably play the list differently or build a list differently. But yeah, I think just talking about the general different builds of Charizard is actually pretty useful because there's a lot of different ways you could go with it right now, like kind of like the Tord thing. You could just do kind of like a more standard list that happens to have the Dusknoir line. Entei is an option that you could have in there, and then of course the what's the four nest ball version that Jake was talking about as well. Kind of the more focus on going first. As Benny, Caleb, you two in particular, I think I played a lot of Charizard. What do you think in terms of what build is like the best right now?
As someone who played a lot of Charizard in the past, I think for this tournament, like it's a lot different playing Charizard into Baltimore than it was playing Charizard into Worlds for me because if I were to play it into Baltimore, I would be saying, okay, I can maybe take like 40-60 against Drago and still win 50 to 55 to 60% of rounds against Drago just because my opponents might mismanage their resources and I can get them with stamp. Like maybe they'll just like throw a Kyurem at me early game and I can go stamp, take a knockout, and then they just start to fall apart from there. But I think I would go for just a super consistent build of Zard and just make sure I'm beating Ancient Box, make sure I'm beating all the turbo decks, and then kind of not play super teched out for Drago. But for Worlds, I was kind of looking at more of like you can use Radzard earlier, you can play like a bunch of nest balls to make sure you're getting set up going first and getting aggressive. You could play like a Dusknoir route, but I don't know if I would even play Dusknoir now, not without the new supporter that makes for the Dusknoir combos next set. I do think it's good into certain matchups, like it's really good against Dragapult, but it's uh, important to make sure you're super consistent against decks like Raging Bolt, decks like Miraidon, Ancient Box. But also there is Charizard Mirror, which is popping up, so maybe I would experiment with 1 to 2 TM Devos, and then that takes the Dusknoir slot, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I agree a lot with Caleb on that. I think you should, if you're playing Charizard to Baltimore, I think you should build your list as consistently as you possibly can. Personally wouldn't play Dusknoir. I haven't found it to be as good as I thought it would be in testing. I was actually experimenting with two-tube barrel, Squovit, and no Pidgeot because I think the Pidgeot is kind of what makes the Drago matchup a bit worse because they can just target it down, knock it out, and then you're left with like nothing after an Iona, which kind of sucks. So I think that deck wasn't horrible. I'm not gonna play it to Baltimore, I don't think, but it might be worth looking into. I'm not 100% sure. But as Caleb said, I would just build your list as consistent as possible. Maybe tech for Charizard Mirror. Um, but yeah, that's what I would leave it at.
The last deck I wanted to cover, we don't have to go super in depth on it either because we kind of covered like everything else of the deck because naturally the meta kind of revolves around Regidrago. At least it did for World and kind of has continued to keep revolving around it to some extent at least. But Caleb, you mentioned at the beginning you're just going to play Drago to Baltimore. So what's the reasoning for why you're doing that?
Yeah, so I think Drago is still the strongest deck position right now because I think all of your matchups are pretty close to 50-50 or favored. Like I think Charizard is favorable. I think decks like Ancient Box, Raging Bolt, Miraidon, Roaring Moon are all close to 50-50. But I do think Drago is a deck where you have to put in a lot of games because every time I play the deck, I'm learning like new routes to take against some of these turbo decks, some of these decks that seem like they're unfavorable matchups on paper. Like there's a lot of different ways where you can play it slower in the beginning and build up to a board where you just Iona them multiple times, bump their stadium, maybe you play some kind of utility stadium like a jamming tower and bumping their Pokestop, disrupting them. Plus potentially you could throw in a Radzard to offset the prize trade, or against certain matchups like Raging Bolt, you can use Gudra to force them to discard 6 energies instead of 4. And I think it makes these matchups like a lot better than they seem. Like you might think that the matchup against Raging Bolt is like 30-70, but in practice it's felt closer to 45-55 really.
Yeah, I agree with Caleb. I think that Drago's easily the strongest deck right now. I don't have enough games with it, so I'm probably not going to play it to Baltimore. I'm definitely going to pack it with me, but it's not something I would likely play to Baltimore. But if I had put more games into it before this event, it would definitely be my number one choice at this point.
All right. So I think the last thing then to talk about before we wrap things up is just meta predictions for what we think for the expected meta for Baltimore in terms of like percentages. Like first place deck would be this with X percentage. I guess I can start. I do think Regidrago will go down. Like I kind of, I don't even want to pick it as number one deck anymore, honestly, because just feel like I've seen so little of it in general, both online and otherwise, that I would not be surprised to see it number two. So I'm gonna go
I think
ahead.
Charizard's going to be number one.
Charizard's like, I think they'll both be really close to each other. I think,
I agree. I think
yeah,
that as opposed to Worlds, I think a lot of the like non-Worlds players would probably rather prefer play Charizard over Regidrago. So I think that Charizard would probably be number one, but the difference between that and Regidrago is very minimal.
yeah, yeah. I think I'm okay with saying like around 15% for both Zard and Drago, and then I would not be surprised to see Ancient Box be like number three because that's Dexter's been like super hot, super popular, and then fourth I'll say. Actually, wait. Let me look at like the decks in general because I already forgot the ones we talked about last time. I could see Miraidon being like fairly popular, I guess too. But I do think I would say those two for sure, top two in some order, and then I kind of want to say Ancient Box and then like Lugia, TBH after that. What do you think, Jake? As someone who's not tested this much after Worlds.
Yeah, I think it's just gonna be like everybody playing whatever they've been playing for the past like month, and nobody's gonna deviate from that. So I think Regidrago is gonna be the most popular deck, but I think like yeah, Zard will be close behind. I think like everybody since like NAIC has been testing Regidrago and will have the cards if you're
Sure.
going to Baltimore. So I think Drago will be number one, and then Zard number two, and then who knows what else. It doesn't. Everything else is going to be sort of like the in the 10% range. So yeah, you have to beat Zard and Drago to do well at the tournament, and then everything else is 10%.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah, makes sense. Benny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so like I said, Zara number one, Drago number two. That's at least in my opinion. Um, I think if we said about like a week ago, I would also say Ancient Box number three, but I have noticed that the deck is starting to die down a little bit. I think it peaked a little bit too early before
Mm.
Baltimore. I would probably put it at fourth behind Raging Bolt, um, and then at fifth maybe something like Miraidon or Roaring Moon, maybe. No, not Roaring Moon. Roaring Moon's dead. Yeah, probably something like Miraidon. And then probably like I don't even know what else there could be. Everything else probably just falls into other at that point.
Yeah, I think that Jake's statement is right that like a lot of people will keep playing what they've been playing, but I do think that a lot of people kind of waited until after Worlds
Yes.
to pick what they're on for Baltimore. So I think that Drago is more of a thing that is stuck with like the top level players, and I think that Charizard will end up being number one. And right now I have pretty much the same as Benny. I think it'll be Charizard, Drago, Raging Bolt, and then Ancient Box. And then after that, everything seems pretty similar, like a mix of like Roaring Moon, Miraidon, Lugia, and then under that a little bit Dragapult. It seems like emerging, but everything under that is pretty much nothingness.
All right, your deck is nothingness. You heard it here from Caleb Rogerson. So I think it's
Your
good.
Bennett Dusknoir deck.
Yeah, nothingness.
Yeah.
All right, I think it's going to be it then for this episode of the Dead Draw Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube. We'll work more on some more Stellar Crown Tabletop after Baltimore, along with a documentary following some of our players' journeys through Worlds. That'll be out when it's ready. Kind of mentioned, like what I mentioned earlier, it's a pretty big project. Let's do some shout-outs. Benny, any shout-outs for you?
Yeah, I want to thank my parents. After Worlds, my sister managed to convince my dad to get a third cat. It's a black cat named Frankie, so I want to shout out him. You know,
Shout
he's
out
kind of
Frankie.
the goat. Yeah, shout out Frankie. We'll leave it at that.
Jake.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter as always, Jake Gearhart, or on this channel.
Caleb.
Yeah, gotta shout out my parents because Benny shouted out his parents. I'm sure my parents will watch this podcast, so yeah, shout out to them. Shout out to Frankie, and shout out to Turtwig.
Of course, shout out to Turtwig. I'll shout out my parents too. They're not going to watch this, but shout out to them. And then, as always, you can find me on Twitter at EtchyOK. I stream on Twitch, twitch.tv/Etchy. I have a TCG YouTube channel and a regular YouTube. You check out, just search Etchy on YouTube and you'll find it. And we're going to go record a bonus episode for the Patreon. We'll be talking about some early Stellar Crown thoughts. So if you're interested in that, definitely go check out our Patreon. The link will be in the description below. Thank you for listening again, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.